Sing Sing Prison, where America perfected the electric chair. For over a century, its walls echoed with fear, executions, and experiments in punishment. Tonight, we uncover the secrets of one of the most infamous prisons in U.S. history. If you love hard-hitting true crime documentaries, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the stories they don't want you to hear. When you hear the name Sing Sing, a chill runs down your spine. This fortress of stone, built along the banks of the Hudson River in Ossining, New York, became one of the most notorious prisons in American history. But to understand how Sing Sing earned its dark reputation, we have to go back to the early 19th century, a time when the United States was still experimenting with what prison should mean. In 1825, the New York legislature decided to build a new penitentiary. The old state prison in Auburn was overcrowded, and society was demanding a more modern approach to punishment. A young man named Elam Linz, a former Army officer, was appointed to oversee the project. Linz had already developed a reputation at Auburn Prison for his strict methods and brutal enforcement of discipline. He believed in silence, hard labor, and absolute obedience. The site chosen for the new prison was in a small town called Mount Pleasant, later renamed Ossining. At the time it was just farmland and rocky hills along the Hudson. But what made the site perfect was the abundance of marble. The plan was to use inmate labor to quarry stone from the site itself, cutting costs and keeping prisoners occupied from dawn to dusk. In 1826, the first group of 100 inmates arrived by barge on the Hudson River. Shackled and chained, they were forced to begin construction of the very prison that would hold them captive. Within just a year, the first cell blocks were complete, and Sing Sing opened its gates. The prison quickly became known as the house built by its inmates. The stone walls were thick, cold, and imposing, a symbol of the unforgiving justice system of the era. The cells were small, barely large enough for a man to lie down, and prisoners were expected to live in total silence. Linz ruled with an iron fist. Discipline was harsh and physical punishment was routine. Guards whipped inmates for speaking out of turn or failing to follow orders. Meals were meager, bread, soup, and occasional meat. But perhaps most oppressive was the silence. Sing Sing enforced the Auburn system, where prisoners were not allowed to speak to one another at all. Day after day they labored in the quarries, stone workshops, and factories, marching in lockstep with their heads down. Sing Sing's name itself became a metaphor for prison life. Going up the river became a phrase in American culture, meaning to be sent to prison because New York City convicts were literally sent upriver to Sing Sing. Its notoriety spread fast, and the prison became a place of both fear and fascination. But Sing Sing wasn't just a place for punishment, it was also an experiment in control. Reformers of the time argued that silence and hard labor would reform criminals, teaching them discipline and morality. In reality, it often broke them. Inmates described the crushing weight of the silence, the exhaustion from endless labor, and the constant threat of punishment. By the mid-19th century, Sing Sing was housing more than 1,000 prisoners, far more than it was designed for. Overcrowding and violence were constant problems, but it was in the late 1800s that Sing Sing would cement its place in American history, not just as a prison, but as the stage for one of the most controversial inventions in criminal justice, the electric chair. The story of how Sing Sing became the execution capital of New York begins in 1891, when the state abandoned hanging in favor of a new scientific method of execution. Sing Sing was chosen to be the place where this method would be tested, refined, and carried out for decades to come. The prison was no longer just a place of labor and silence. It became the site of death. By the late 1800s, executions in New York were becoming a public spectacle. Hanging had long been the official method of execution, but it was messy, unreliable, and increasingly controversial. Sometimes the rope snapped. Other times, the condemned strangled slowly in front of horrified crowds. Reformers, scientists, and politicians began asking, was there a more civilized way to kill? In 1888, New York passed a groundbreaking law. The state would replace hanging with electrocution. This was the first law of its kind in the world. The decision was partly influenced by the war of currents raging between Thomas Edison, who championed direct current, DC, and Nikola Tesla, whose alternating current, AC, threatened Edison's dominance. Edison, eager to discredit AC, argued it was dangerous, and what better way to prove it than by using it in executions? The state commissioned the first electric chair, designed by a dentist named Alfred Southwick. His idea was that electrocution would be faster, more humane, and more scientific than the gallows. The first test subjects were stray dogs and horses. After those trials, the chair was installed at Auburn Prison, where the first execution by electricity took place in 1890. William Kemmler, a convicted murderer. But Kemmler's execution was a disaster. Instead of a quick, painless death, Kemmler convulsed violently as the current surged through his body. The first jolt failed to kill him. Witnesses described the smell of burning flesh as smoke rose from his head. He gasped for air before the current was applied again. It took nearly 8 minutes before he was declared dead. Despite the horror, New York officials pressed forward. By 1891, they decided Auburn would no longer be the center of executions. That responsibility would fall to Sing Sing, which already housed New York's death row. The state's second electric chair was built inside the prison, and it would remain in use for more than 60 years. From that point on, Sing Sing became synonymous with execution. The first man to die in its chair was Charles McIlvaine, convicted of murder. On July 7, 1891, he was strapped into the chair before a small group of witnesses. Guards applied the electrodes to his head and legs, and at 12:41 a.m., the current was turned on. Unlike Kemmler's botched execution, McIlvaine's was swift. Newspapers reported that he died instantly, though others whispered it wasn't quite so clean. Over the decades, hundreds more followed him. The chair earned grim nicknames: Old Sparky, the Hot Seat, the Sizzle Chair. Each execution was carried out in a specially built room inside the prison, far from the public eye. Only a small group of officials, journalists, and witnesses were allowed inside. The procedure was ritualistic. The condemned man, or in rare cases woman, would be led from death row into the chamber. A black cap was placed over the prisoner's head. The electrodes were attached and leather straps bound the arms, chest, and legs. When the warden gave the signal, the switch was pulled. Witnesses often described the body stiffening, eyes bulging, and smoke or even flames rising from the prisoner's skin. The smell of burning hair and flesh was unforgettable. For many, the electric chair symbolized progress, science replacing the crude violence of the rope. But to others, it was barbaric, a new kind of cruelty disguised as modernity. Civil rights groups, religious leaders, and even some doctors condemned it. Still, the executions went on. Sing Sing quickly gained a reputation as the place where criminals met their end. Between 1891 and 1963, over 600 men and women were executed there, more than at any other prison in America. Some were notorious gangsters, killers, and spies. Others were poor men with weak legal defenses, swept into the system with little chance of survival. Perhaps the most famous case came in 1953, when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, convicted of spying for the Soviet Union during the Cold War, were executed at Sing Sing. Their deaths shocked the world and remain one of the most debated executions in American history. For supporters, the Rosenbergs were traitors who sold secrets that endangered national security. For critics, they were scapegoats in an era of anti-communist hysteria. But whether the condemned was a high-profile criminal or an unknown man from the streets of New York, the result was the same: a walk down the last corridor at Sing Sing, a final moment in the electric chair, and a death that was meant to be hidden yet echoed far beyond the prison walls. The chair did more than kill, it defined Sing Sing. It turned the prison into a symbol of state power, a place where justice, fear, and science collided in one unforgettable spectacle. And yet, even as executions became routine, Sing Sing itself was changing. Beneath its dark reputation, a new philosophy of punishment and reform was beginning to emerge, led by a warden who believed prison could mean more than silence and death. For decades, Sing Sing had been defined by fear, by silence, by stone walls, and by the electric chair. But in 1920, a new man took charge who would attempt to rewrite its legacy: Warden Lewis Lawes. Lawes believed in something radical for his time, that prisons could rehabilitate, not just punish. Born in Massachusetts in 1883, Lawes had worked his way up through the correctional system. Unlike many wardens before him, he wasn't obsessed with discipline alone. He believed prisoners were human beings, capable of change if given the right tools and opportunities. When Lawes arrived at Sing Sing, he inherited a nightmare. The prison was overcrowded, violent, and feared across the country. Executions had made it infamous, but conditions inside were brutal. Men crammed into tiny cells, fights erupting in the yard, despair hanging in the air like smoke. Lawes wasted no time making changes. He opened up programs that had never before existed in a maximum security prison. Education became central to his vision. He established classes for inmates to learn to read and write, and for those with more skills, advanced programs in literature, history, and even law. He invited professors and community leaders to lecture inside the prison walls. Sports became another avenue for rehabilitation. Baseball diamonds were built on the grounds, and soon Sing Sing had a team that played against outside opponents. The games drew large crowds and gave inmates a chance to experience teamwork and discipline in a way that punishment alone never could. But perhaps Lawes' most famous innovation was the Sing Sing Theater. Inmates were allowed to stage plays, musicals and performances, often in front of invited guests from outside the prison. The theater gave men a chance to express themselves creatively, to act, to write, to find meaning beyond their sentences. The productions became so popular that Sing Sing earned the nickname, the Big House on the Hudson, not only for its grim walls but also for its surprising culture of art. Lawes also humanized the execution process, even as he couldn't abolish it. He personally witnessed every electrocution, standing with the condemned in their final moments. He made it a rule that no man should walk alone on the way to the chair. He himself often took the prisoner's arm, walking side by side to the chamber. It was his way of giving dignity in the face of death. In his memoirs, Lawes wrote that he opposed the death penalty but was bound by law to enforce it. To him, the responsibility was a heavy burden. He once remarked, "I have executed many men but I have never killed anyone. It is the law that has done that." His reforms didn't stop at education and theater. Lawes pushed for vocational training, teaching inmates trades like carpentry, printing, and mechanics. The idea was simple but revolutionary. When prisoners left Sing Sing, they would have a skill they could use to rebuild their lives. Lawes' philosophy resonated far beyond the prison walls. He became a national figure, giving speeches about the possibility of rehabilitation in American prisons. Newspapers praised his vision, and Hollywood even came calling. His life inspired the 1932 film 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, starring Spencer Tracy. But not everyone supported his approach. Critics argued that he was being too soft on criminals, that murderers and gangsters didn't deserve baseball or theater. To them, prison was supposed to be about punishment, not opportunity. Lawes disagreed, insisting that treating men with humanity made prisons safer, for inmates, for guards, and for society. His tenure was not without challenges. Violence still broke out. Riots still threatened. And executions continued, with old Sparky humming to life again and again. Yet for many, Lawes transformed Sing Sing from a symbol of pure punishment into a place where the possibility of redemption flickered, even in the darkest of cells. Perhaps most importantly, he gave prisoners a sense of hope, something almost unheard of in a place built on despair. Men who once thought their lives were over found new meaning, whether on stage, in a classroom, or on a ball field. By the time Lawes retired in 1941, Sing Sing was still one of America's most feared prisons. But under his leadership, it had also become one of the most studied, debated, and, ironically, admired. He had shown that even in a fortress of death, there could be room for life, dignity, and second chances. Sing Sing would never lose its reputation as the last mile for the condemned. But thanks to Lawes, it also became a testing ground for the idea that prisons could be more than cages, they could be laboratories of human transformation. If Sing Sing's walls could talk, they would echo with the footsteps of America's most notorious criminals. Over the years, the prison became home to murderers, gangsters, spies, and outlaws whose names filled headlines across the nation. For some, it was the last stop before execution. For others, it was a cage that defined the rest of their lives. One of the earliest infamous inmates was Albert Fish, a serial killer so depraved that newspapers called him the Boogeyman. Convicted of murdering a young girl in the 1920s, Fish confessed to unspeakable acts that horrified even hardened detectives. In January 1936, he was executed in Sing Sing's electric chair. Witnesses claimed the chair had to be used multiple times because of the metal needles Fish had inserted into his own body over the years. His death was as unsettling as his life, and his story only deepened Sing Sing's reputation for hosting America's darkest souls. The prison also held some of the most famous gangsters of the Prohibition era. Louis Lepka Buckleter, head of the notorious Murder Incorporated syndicate, arrived at Sing Sing in the early 1940s. He was the only major mob boss ever executed by the federal government. Alongside his lieutenants, Buckleter was put to death in Old Sparky in 1944, marking a rare moment when organized crime's most powerful figures faced the state's ultimate punishment. But perhaps no executions captured global attention more than those of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Convicted in 1951 of conspiring to pass atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, the Rosenbergs' trial took place at the height of Cold War paranoia. To supporters, they were scapegoats caught in a wave of anti-communist hysteria. To prosecutors and much of the American public, They were traitors whose actions threatened national security. On June 19, 1953, Julius was led first to the chair. At 8:06 p.m., he was declared dead after 2 jolts of electricity. 10 minutes later, Ethel followed. Witnesses reported that the first jolt failed to kill her. A second and then a third charge were needed before doctors pronounced her dead. The image of a husband and wife dying in the chair seared itself into history, sparking protests worldwide and leaving behind one of the most controversial executions in U.S. history. Sing Sing also became the final stop for Ruth Snyder, whose sensational trial captivated the nation in the 1920s. Snyder and her lover were convicted of murdering her husband in a botched insurance scheme. On the night of her execution in 1928, a journalist from the New York Daily News smuggled a tiny camera into the death chamber, hidden in his pant leg. At the moment Snyder was electrocuted, he snapped a photo. The next morning, her contorted face appeared on the front page of the newspaper under the headline, "Dead." It was one of the most infamous photographs in American history, and it shocked readers with its raw depiction of death in the chair. There were also cases that spoke to deeper issues of justice, or injustice. Many of the men executed at Sing Sing were poor, immigrants, or people of color who lacked strong legal defense. Civil rights advocates often argued that the death penalty at Sing Sing disproportionately targeted the vulnerable. Each execution raised questions. Was justice truly being served, or was the state simply eliminating the powerless? At the same time, Sing Sing also held prisoners who would later use their time to reshape their lives. The famous writer Chester Himes, for example, served time at Sing Sing in the 1930s. While incarcerated, he began writing short stories. After his release, he went on to become one of the most important African-American crime novelists of the 20th century. His story was proof that even within Sing Sing's grim walls, creativity and redemption were possible. By the mid-20th century, the electric chair had claimed over 600 lives within Sing Sing. Some were names etched into history, others forgotten except for a line in prison records. But together they created a grim ledger that made the prison infamous worldwide. Every execution carried a ritual: the slow walk down the last mile, the final words, the pull of the switch, the lingering smell of burnt flesh. For the families of victims, it was justice. For opponents of capital punishment, it was barbarism. For Sing Sing, it was identity. Yet even as these stories unfolded, the prison remained a paradox. It was both a killing ground and a stage for reform. It destroyed lives but also, sometimes, rebuilt them. That tension, between brutality and redemption, would define Sing Sing for generations. For most of its history, Sing Sing wasn't just a stage for executions or reform experiments, it was a grinding machine of everyday survival. To the outside world, it was a symbol of punishment. But for those inside, life was a relentless battle against overcrowding, violence, and despair. By the early 20th century, Sing Sing had become notorious for the sheer number of men crammed into its cells. Designed for a few hundred inmates, it often held well over 2,000. Each tiny stone cell measured barely 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, so narrow that prisoners could stretch out an arm and touch both walls. In many cases, 2 men were forced to share a single cell, sleeping head to foot like sardines in a can. In these suffocating quarters, privacy did not exist. The sounds of coughing, muttering, and metal chains clanking echoed through the night. The smell of sweat, damp stone, and unwashed bodies filled the air. For some, the crushing confinement drove them into depression. For others, it fueled explosive violence. Guards often ruled with brutality. Reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe regular use of whippings, beatings, and the sweat box, a form of solitary confinement where prisoners were locked in stifling cells without ventilation. Discipline was absolute, and any hint of disobedience was punished swiftly. Even during Warden Lawes' era of reform, the underlying culture of control never fully disappeared. Life was dictated by routine. At dawn, prisoners were woken by bells and marched in silence to breakfast, usually a bowl of oatmeal or bread with weak coffee. Afterward, they were sent to work in the prison's shops or the quarry. Labor was constant: chiseling stone, sewing uniforms, making license plates, or printing materials. For many, the monotony was crushing, but it was also the only way to keep their minds from breaking under confinement. The prison yard offered one of the few moments of relative freedom. There, inmates walked in circles, traded whispers, or flexed dominance in tense confrontations. Fights were common, and stabbing sometimes erupted over debts, insults, or gang rivalries. Sing Sing became known for its hidden subculture of codes and alliances, where survival depended on who you trusted, or who you feared. Overcrowding magnified these tensions. By the 1930s and 1940s, journalists who toured the facility reported that men were sleeping three to a cell, some on the floor, others in makeshift hammocks strung above bunks. With inadequate medical care, disease spread quickly. Tuberculosis and influenza swept through the blocks, leaving some prisoners to die slowly in their cells. Yet daily life at Sing Sing was not only about suffering. It was also about endurance. Inmates developed routines to cope, writing letters, reading borrowed books, carving chess pieces from scraps, or simply staring at the Hudson River through barred windows, imagining freedom on the other side. The prison chapel offered another refuge. For decades, chaplains worked tirelessly to bring faith to the inmates. Many condemned men spent their last hours in prayer there, seeking forgiveness before walking the last mile to the chair. But for most prisoners, the greatest torment was psychological. The knowledge that executions were happening just yards away created an atmosphere of constant dread. Men in nearby blocks reported hearing the faint hum of the generator on execution nights, followed by silence, and then the clatter of guards removing the body. Some described it as a shadow that hung over the entire prison, a reminder that the state could take life at any moment. Sing Sing's brutality also drew the attention of reformers and journalists. Investigations in the mid-20th century revealed shocking conditions: guards extorting prisoners, inmates beaten unconscious for minor infractions, and cell blocks so overcrowded that men slept sitting up. While some wardens tried to implement reforms, the sheer size and reputation of Sing Sing made it nearly impossible to transform completely. By the 1960s, as America's prison crisis deepened, Sing Sing became a symbol of everything wrong with the penal system. Inhumane conditions, endless overcrowding, racial tensions, and the inescapable presence of death row. Yet despite constant criticism, the prison continued to operate, its name still carrying weight in American culture. Life inside Sing Sing was a contradiction, harsh, violent, and dehumanizing, but also filled with stories of resilience. For every man who broke under the weight of its stone walls, another found ways to survive, adapt, and even grow. In this way, the prison became not only a place of punishment but also a crucible where human spirit was tested daily. Sing Sing's location on the banks of the Hudson River gave it a grim beauty, but also a constant temptation. Beyond the prison's walls lay the glittering water, and just past it, freedom. For nearly 2 centuries, inmates tried to seize it. Few succeeded. From the very beginning, escape attempts were woven into Sing Sing's history. In the 19th century, men used crude tools to chip away at the marble they themselves had quarried, tunneling in secret. Others tried bribing guards or scaling walls under cover of darkness. But the prison's design, combined with its isolated location, made it one of the hardest places in America to break free. In the 1930s, as the prison population swelled, escape attempts became bolder. One of the most famous was in 1932, when 5 inmates managed to overpower guards and steal weapons. They dashed for the river, exchanging gunfire with corrections officers. 2 were killed almost instantly. The others were captured before they made it to the shore. Their failed attempt made headlines nationwide and reinforced Sing Sing's reputation as inescapable. The Hudson itself was a weapon of confinement. Even if a man managed to slip past guards and walls, icy waters, swift currents, and watchful patrols made survival unlikely. More than one desperate prisoner drowned in the river, their bodies found downstream days later. Sing Sing's security was also reinforced by the ever-present threat of punishment. Prisoners who attempted escape faced solitary confinement, beatings, or extended sentences. For those already on death row, attempts at freedom usually ended in violent standoffs. They had nothing to lose. Over the years, the prison adapted its defenses. Guard towers overlooked every yard and wall. Floodlights illuminated the grounds at night, and armed officers patrolled both inside and outside the facility. In later decades, modern technologies like motion sensors, cameras, and reinforced steel gates made the fortress even harder to penetrate. Yet the dream of escape never disappeared. Inmates whispered plans in the yard, passed notes through hidden codes, and carved makeshift weapons from scrap metal. Each attempt, successful or not, reflected the same truth: that even in one of the most feared prisons in America, the human desire for freedom could never be fully crushed. Perhaps the greatest irony was that most who tried to flee Sing Sing didn't want to start new lives. Many were hardened criminals who knew they would be hunted forever. For them, the act of breaking out was less about freedom and more about defiance. One last chance to show that the prison didn't own them. By the late 20th century, Sing Sing had faced dozens of escape attempts. Some were laughably amateurish, others chillingly close to success. But almost all ended the same way, with the inmate dead, captured, or broken by punishment. The walls of Sing Sing, first built from stone quarried by its own prisoners, had stood the test of time. For nearly 200 years they had kept men in, and kept the world out. Escape was a fantasy, a story whispered in cells, but rarely a reality. Today, Sing Correctional Facility remains one of the most legendary prisons in America. From the cold silence of its earliest days, to the fiery hum of the electric chair, to the bold reforms of Warden Lewis Lawes, it has embodied every contradiction of the American justice system. It was a place of death, where more than 600 men and women were executed. But it was also a place of life, where inmates learned, performed, and even wrote their way toward redemption. It was overcrowded, brutal, and feared. Yet it also became a laboratory for change, influencing how prisons across the nation would operate. To this day, the name Sing Sing is shorthand for punishment, a reminder of the thin line between justice and cruelty. Its legacy forces us to ask difficult questions. Should prisons punish or rehabilitate? Does the death penalty deliver justice, or just another layer of suffering? As the sun sets on the Hudson River, casting its light on the walls of Sing Sing, one truth remains. Within those stone cells lived countless stories of crime, punishment, and humanity. And those stories, for better or worse, continue to shape how we see justice in America.